if you look at his paintings, you'll see water and architecture, things like bridges. There's people and still lifes and all different types of things. So yeah, the landscapes and the gardens, those paintings are beautiful and they're spectacular, but he painted so many other types of things. And so the purpose of kind of today's program is so give you a chance to see some of these other types of works. If you are a person that visits museums, some of these paintings you probably have seen in the past. If you have not, yeah, but you might have only seen him like on a one-off, like, oh, okay, here's a picture that he did of the ocean. But you might not realize that he did many pictures of the ocean kind of in a similar series. So what I'm going to do is we go through the paintings and look at them. They're going to be grouped into kind of categories. You can kind of see how things fit into the overall big picture context. Now, again, Monet was born in Paris in November 14th, 1840. So this is Paris, where Monet was born on November 14th. And now you might be thinking, that's Paris. Where's the Eiffel Tower? Well, the Eiffel Tower hadn't been built in 1840. That comes along a little bit later, but this is where Monet spends the first few years of his life. But then later on, his family moves to a place called Le Havre, which is on the northern coast of France. It's on the English Channel. His father was a wealthy businessman. He was a merchant in the mercantile business, and he decided that this part of France would be better suited for his business endeavors. So when Monet is a boy of about 5, the family starts the transition earlier, before he's 5, but by the time he's 5, they're fully set up in this area of France. And just for geographic purposes, I always like to give people a kind of overview of what they're looking at. So this is a map of France. Obviously, you can see Paris is kind of in the top middle. The blue dot is where Giverny is. And then you can see the coastline, the plot where they were in the Le Havre. Not far from Normandy, if you're familiar with that term. This is Monet's parents, his father and his mom on the left, and then his older brother. Now, it's unfortunate because Monet's mom passed away when he was a teenager, and he was very close to her. She was very supportive of his artistic endeavors. Not so much his father, unfortunately, which actually causes some friction in the relationship between Claude Monet and his father. But again, this is a family portrait of his mom and his dad on the left. His mom passes away when he's a teenager. And then a portrait of his brother on the right, his older brother. Monet only had one brother. He did not have any sisters. And this is a colorized photo of Monet as a young man in his early to mid-20s. This picture was originally a black and white photograph, but different people take historical black and white photos and colorize them. So let's talk of Monet. I've kind of split this presentation up into 2 categories, or 2 kind of sections, so to speak. The first section is covering Monet's time from when he was 15 to when he's 31, and he has a big event takes place when he's 31, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then subsequently, we talk about the years after 31. But this is a picture of Monet. And again, if I was to walk around an art museum and show this picture to people and say, hey, which famous artist is this? I'm guessing it would stump a lot of people. Now, if you recognize this picture, well, then kudos to you. You are an astute person of artistic history, but not many people recognize this photo of Monet unless you're a big Monet fan. So Monet starts drawing and creating artwork from a very early age. These are some drawings that he did as a teenager, and I wanted to show these to you because they look so different and unusual than his other work. So let's take a look at these 2. This first one is a caricature, and this is something that he did on a regular basis when he was a teenager. I shaded the number down at the bottom. That's the year this was made. And so Monet made this when he was only 15 or 16 years old. And he frequently made these caricatures with these large heads on them. And what's kind of funny is he ended up actually selling quite a few of these. So it was a really big boost for his confidence, the fact that he was able to sell his artwork as a teenager. Now, he wasn't selling them for very much money, but just the fact that he was able to get any money for making art was a really big confidence boost for him. You see a number of these caricatures that he made. I like to show these to people because There's a lot of these that are in museums and floating around and stuff, but suppose you saw this like in your grandparents' attic or or at a garage sale or something. Would you recognize this as Monet and keep it safe and protect it? Maybe not. You might not even realize it's one of his artworks. But again, 15 or 16 years old. There's the full view of that. Pretty talented, I would say. And this is a drawing that he did of a shoreline along the English Channel in northern France. And he would have made this when he was about 16 or 17. So pretty talented. It's interesting if you go through and look at the history of art. A number of artists like Monet and Georgia O'Keeffe and Picasso got their starts really early in life. Many other artists started a little bit later, like Van Gogh and Matisse come to mind. So, but Monet is starting out making art early. Now, this is the earliest known painting by Claude Monet. And if you, again, were to see something that looked like this, would you recognize it? It doesn't really look like a characteristic Monet in many regards. In some regards, it does. The fact that it's a landscape painting, but it doesn't quite look like the later Monet works we would be considering. But you have to remember, Monet lives to be 86 years old, and he makes this painting when he's 18. He basically is creating art for over 70 years. And as you can imagine, things would change over time. If you've done anything for 10 or 20 years, you maybe not necessarily do it the exact same way you would have done 10 or 20 years ago. This painting is in a private collection. It's owned by a private individual. You can't see it on display at a museum. It was made in 1858 when he was only 18 years old, and there's the full view. It looks very photographic. It doesn't look Impressionist style at all. And there's a close-up. That actually almost looks like it could be a photograph when you zoom in on it, depending on the resolution on your computer. Okay, so Monet has to take a break from painting when he's 21 years old because he gets drafted into the French army and he gets shipped off to Algeria. Algeria was part of the French colonial empire. Algeria is in northwest Africa. France had a large military contingent there to kind of help keep the peace. And Monet he participates in the draft lottery, and he drew a bad number, got drafted, gets shipped off to Algeria. So how did Monet like being in the army? He hated it. He liked being in Algeria. He thought it was a really exotic, interesting place, a lot different than what he was accustomed to in France. But as far as the actual being in the military, he did not like that part of the years of his life at all. But what happens with him, he gets very sick while he's in Algeria, and he gets sent back to Paris to recuperate. And while he's there, he has an aunt, his father's sister, who kind of became somewhat of a surrogate mother for him after his own mom passed away. She was very wealthy herself, like his father was. She did not have any children of her own, and she took a liking to Monet. And while he's recuperating and spending time with her, he's lamenting about how terrible it is to be in the military and how he'd like to get out. And so France at this point in time, they had a program where if you came up with enough money, you could get out of your military service. And so it was interesting that Monet's father could have easily paid for Claude Monet not to serve in the military, but he did not do that. Actually, let me go back to the pictures of his father. Hold on one second. He did not do that. Monet's father did not like the fact that he was an artist. He wanted him to take over the family business. And Claude Monet did not want to do that. He wanted to be an artist. And so they have this constant conflict from Monet's teenage years until his father passes away. But his father very easily could have come up with the money to get Monet out of the draft, but he decided not to. But when he gets sick, and he comes back to France and he's recuperating and telling his situation to his aunt, she feels sorry for him and she ends up paying off the military obligation under one condition. The condition is he has to go get an education. And so he says, yeah, sure, I'll go do that. So he gets out of the military and he enrolls in school. But what she doesn't realize, his aunt, he enrolls in an art school. And she was like, well, that wasn't really part of the deal, Claude. She thought that maybe he would go to school to be a doctor or an attorney or something like that, but he had visions of going to art school, and so that's what he ends up doing. He does not stay in art school for very long, though, because he did not like the academic aspects of it. There's a number of well-known artists throughout history. They really struggled in formal art programs because they want to kind of do their own thing, and the art kind of teachers are telling them, hey, you have to do things this way, the way it's always been done in the past. And so people like Monet and Van Gogh and Picasso, they struggle in these kind of artistic, academic environments, so to speak. So let's talk about some of the paintings that Monet made in the first half of his life. And again, I've grouped them up kind of in a category so that you can kind of see that he did paint many other things besides just gardens and landscapes. So these are 3 still lifes that he did. Let's take a look at these. And what I did is I included where these paintings are at in case they're at a place where close by to where you live or where you might be visiting at some point in time in the future. So this is at the National Gallery of Art. Monet paints this in 1862. He was 22 years old. He had just gotten out of the army a few months prior to this. This is a still life. And one thing that's interesting also about this particular aspect of Monet's life is a lot of artists, when they're early on, they're developing their skills, they paint a bottle or a glass or something similar with water in it. And you can see that's what Monet has done here on the left side. And it's really kind of a technique or a challenge to see if you can paint this and make it look kind of realistic. And so if you were to walk around a large art museum, you'll find a number of artists that have painted some type of either a glass bottle or a drinking glass that has water in it. But look at the date. They're almost always painted kind of early on in the artist's career because it's like a challenge. Like, okay, this is your assignment. You have, if you're a good artist, you should be able to paint water in a glass and make it look realistic. And so that's what you have Monet doing here. And there's the close-up. So I'd say he did a pretty good job with that. But Monet frequently paints still lifes throughout his career. Again, even though he's known as being the garden guy and the landscape guy. These, oh, and sorry, I forgot to mention. So as far as the paintings that Monet made, if you were to list them all from the first one to the last one, this is about number 10 on the list. So he had made drawings and sketches and things like this. But as far as oil paintings, this is about the 10th earliest of all the paintings that he made. So he did a pretty good job. This is another still life. This is at the Cleveland Museum of Art. This is called Spring Flowers. And what's noteworthy about this one is how detailed it is. Remember, the Monet kind of paintings from later on in his life have that impressionistic style, but you don't see that at this point in time. Look at how detailed these are. It doesn't look exactly like a photograph, but he's taken a lot of time to include all the details of the individual flowers. This is another still life, this one with flowers and flute. This is at the John Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. I see a couple people have already said in the comments that they've seen this one. So kudos to you. And again, notice the detail of the flowers and the fruit. So still lifes are a very important part of Monet's early career. In fact, I included quotes from Monet so you can kind of learn more about him. He says famously, "I perhaps owe having become a painter to flowers." So how about that? And there's the 2 flowers side by side. So just beautiful works of art. And again, if you were to look at one of these in a museum, you might say, oh, okay, that's nice. That's a nice early painting of his, but you might not realize kind of the context. Like, okay, early on in his career, he's focusing, let me actually back up if you don't mind. Early on in his career, one of the things he's focusing on is these still lifes. And still lifes was something that he would do for the remainder of his career for the first many decades of his career. Later in life, he did not do that. He does make many still lifes during his career. Okay, let's continue on. Another thing that you see frequently in Monet's paintings are people, in particular friends or family. And so Monet is kind of a homebody to a certain degree. He does like to go out and visit things, kind of looking for landscapes and stuff to paint. But when he's not doing that, he really just likes to stay at home. He's a friendly guy, but he's kind of reserved, and he really just likes spending time with friends and family. And so he includes them frequently in artworks. And so let's go through 5 examples. This was his doctor posing for him. Looks very distinguished. What's noteworthy about this painting is you wouldn't know that he was a doctor per se just by looking at him. Sometimes when an artist makes a portrait of a person, they want to include, or they try and include, things that will give you hints on what that person does for a living. But he did not do that in this particular case. Just looks like a distinguished gentleman. Here's a close-up. And again, this is Monet's doctor. This is Monet's friend Bazille and his girlfriend at the time, Camille. So we'll talk about both of these people a little bit later, but he includes them in a portrait. So that's his friend on the left, a well-known artist, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then at the time, the woman on the right was his girlfriend, although he would later marry her. So he includes them. And then this is also same woman. Now, this is one of his famous early paintings. He was really proud of this work. He spent a lot of time putting this together. It's a really large painting. It's life size. And this is his girlfriend. And she's got this really cool dress on with the jacket. And it's an interesting portrait in the sense that she's facing away from us. He's really kind of showcasing or highlighting her clothing, but you can see her face and then also her hand because she's turning to the right. But he was really proud of this. At the time he painted this, he considered this like his best painting to date that he had made. Here's the full view. One thing this you can see with a lot of, not all of them, but a lot of Monet's early paintings that have people in them, the dark grounds are frequently very dark. Not all of them, or sorry, the backgrounds are frequently very dark. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. And this is in particular. Now, this is his son. So Monet and his girlfriend have a child together. And at this point in time, they're not married. And it's creating a lot of friction between their two families. Her family did not like the fact that she was hanging out with this artist guy. And I'm not sure what the issue was that his father had with her. I think his dad was just kind of had very clear expectations on what he expected from Claude Monet. And already he was upset that the fact that he was pursuing this artistic endeavor instead of taking over the family business, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of conflict between the relationship between Camille and Claude, but they stick with it. They have a child together, and later on they would get married. So this is a portrait of his son after he was born. So there's some debate on who the woman is on the right. The National Gallery of Art believes it's the baby's mother, and some other people say, no, 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 it's not her. It's actually a friend. So subject to debate. But don't get hung up on that because it's a beautiful painting nonetheless. And this is called The Luncheon. This is at a museum in Germany. I like to look at paintings like this because I like this painting a lot. It's really neat, but it doesn't look like what you'd expect a Monet painting to look like. It definitely looks kind of like a French European painting, but does not look like what you'd expect to see from Monet. It's kind of sort of like a still life in the sense that he's included the food on the table and the glassware and the wine and things like that. But then it's also kind of like a portrait. He's got these individual people in here. So people is something that you frequently see in Monet paintings. Be on the lookout for that. This was an area of northern France where his father spent time. So Monet and his girlfriend are living in Paris, and she ends up having the baby. He's staying with his father and his aunt, kind of going back and forth between the two of them. And this is a resort community. So these 4 paintings he made shortly after his son was born, and they're in northern France. Another frequent theme of Monet paintings is water, whether it's rivers or lakes or ponds or the oceans. You just see water frequently in his paintings. You can be on the lookout for that. So again, if you were to see one of these paintings at a museum, you say, oh, okay, that's nice. That's a really nice early painting. But you may not realize it was part of a whole series of works that he did around the same time. And so with this kind of online Zoom type format, you can look at art like in this type of context to see how things fit in with one another. And this is probably the most famous one of the series. That's actually his father in the bottom right of the painting, looking very dapper. And again, water's a frequent theme in Monet paintings. Okay, so let's talk about some paintings that Monet made in London and the Netherlands. And it says expat. Why did he become an expat? Well, here's what happens. Let's talk about this. So the two paintings that are on the left, Monet made in London. The one on the right is while he was living in the Netherlands. Let's talk about this point in time. So there's a well-known painting at the National Gallery of Art that's by this artist, Bazille, and he was the person who was in the painting that I showed you a few minutes ago with Monet's girlfriend. And if you look at the dates on this, notice that Frederick Bazille, he was born in 1841 and he died in 1870. And this painting was actually made in 1870, so he lived a pretty short life. And he made this painting just a few months before he died. This is Monet's very good friend. Monet is not, he has a pretty good relationship with his brother, but his best friends are really these fellow artists that he ends up meeting throughout his lifetime. And so again, this is a well-known painting at the National Gallery of Art by an artist other than Claude Monet, which we'll explain the connection in a minute. And so again, we saw the picture on the left, or the painting on the left that Monet made. That's his friend on the left. And then the friend, Frederick Bazille, this is a self-portrait that he did of himself that's in Chicago. And then over on the right is Bazille in a military uniform. So the Franco-Prussian War breaks out, and France needs a lot of manpower to partake in this endeavor against Prussia. Prussia is pretty much where Germany is today. Those countries have been fighting during the Franco-Prussian War. People are joining up to be in the army and or being drafted. And so Bazille is in the army. And unfortunately for him, he ends up getting killed in battle. This is a painting that's at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. It's not the exact same battle that Bazille was in, but the time frame is very close by. So he's killed, and Monet is very distraught by that because he was very good close friends with this. They're almost like brothers. So imagining one of your closest friends goes off to war and gets killed, that would probably have a significant impact on you. And Monet is very concerned about being in the army himself. Remember, he was in the military before in Algeria. He did not like that experience. He's worried about being drafted back into the French army. And so he ends up leaving and moving to London to get away from the draft. And he spends several months there at that point in time. And he made a lot of these, what would later become well-known early London paintings. Now, at this point in time, he's a struggling artist. He's trying to support not only himself, but his wife. They subsequently got married, and his young son. I forgot to mention when Monet got married, he was on the outs with his father. His father didn't even go to his wedding. That's how kind of up and down their relationship was. But there's a whole series of paintings that Monet made the first time he went to London. And that's why he goes there, because he's worried about getting drafted and getting sent off to battle and killed like his friend Bazille. Beautiful painting. So the British are interesting. They're very proud of the fact that Monet lived in London. They've kind of almost like semi-adopted him, which is interesting because there's a little bit of a conflict, so to speak, a kind of a friendly conflict, kind of like there would be between brothers, between England and France throughout history. This is another painting that Monet made during that time. It's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's called Green Park. You can kind of see it sort of looking more Monet-esque, so to speak. Now, later on, we're not going to talk about these paintings because they're after in Monet, the second half of his life, and we have a whole separate program on that. I just wanted to point out, if you've seen paintings that look like either this or this is the Waterloo Bridge in London, painted in 1904. This is the House of Parliament, painted in 1903. So Monet does a whole series of painting later on in his life in London, and he was familiar with London because he had gone there during this point in time in his life. So there's that connection between the two places there. So if you see any of these works of Monet that he made in London, you have to look at the date and see, are they early ones like these two? Or are they later ones like these two? There's a big difference in his life. Then after Monet leaves London, he goes to Netherlands and paints quite a few works there. And so these are interesting that they're Monet paintings, but they're not in France, they're in the Netherlands. And so this is at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. You can see the distinctive windmills. Notice how on this painting, the sky takes up a huge portion of the painting. If you or I were to take a picture of this, say with our phone, I'm guessing that the average person would not have included as much of the sky in the painting as Monet did, but he's very interested in light and the atmosphere and how things change with the cloud cover. And so he actually thought that was more important or more interesting than the landscape itself. Thus, it takes up, I don't know, about 70% of the painting. Now, again, just as he did in London, Monet would return to the Netherlands and paint some other artwork. So if you see these Monet paintings of the Netherlands, you have to look at the date to see when he painted them. So these were on a subsequent trip. He made this one in 1874. And then likewise, this one is also in 1874. But again, this is a subsequent trip. So he leaves France, goes to London, goes to the Netherlands, and then returns to France. And then later makes a subsequent trip to the Netherlands and makes several subsequent trips to London. Okay, so then when finally the Franco-Prussian War ends, and a lot of people besides Monet ended up leaving France. Camille Pissarro, famous Impressionist artist, he also fled France to London at this point in time, as did a number of other individuals. The war was pretty unpopular at that point in time for large segments of the French population, but eventually the war ends. Monet returns back to France, and so we're going to talk about the years now between 1871 and 1883. And the reason why we're going to end in 1883 is that's when Monet moves to Giverny, and his career really kind of goes off on a little bit of different of a tangent. And so we're focused on the early works, and so that's why we're going to conclude it 1883. So when he's back home in France, kind of things that you see frequently in his paintings are kind of family and home type themes. He was a little bit of a nomad while he's traveling around to London and the Netherlands. The finances were very tight. And so, I'm sure no doubt homesick. Monet likes being around friends and family. So the fact that the war ends and he's able to return to France was probably very comforting for him. And you can see that in his artwork. A lot of the early themes when he gets back are friends, family, homes, and things like that. This is a painting at the Cleveland Museum of Art. This one is pretty well known. I actually think it's kind of haunting because that's his wife outside and she's peering into the window, and she would later die. We'll talk about the death of Monet's first wife a little bit later, but to me this painting is kind of I don't know, it's unusual in the sense that she's outside looking in. It's kind of the way it would end up being for Monet, because he would lose her, she would pass away, and then he would subsequently remarry. So Monet outlived both of his parents. He also outlived his two wives, and he outlived one of his two sons. But this is at the Cleveland Museum of Art. It's always neat to go to museums throughout the world, and they are always really proud of their collection, and it's neat to go look and see which paintings they're most proud of. And when you go to Cleveland Museum of Art, you can tell this one they're really, really proud of because they included a lot of their educational and marketing materials. And there's a close-up. It looks kind of haunting. Then this is Monet's son, Jean. And again, he's returning home. He's focused on home life and his family and things like that. Now, remember, we saw his son earlier, just after he was born, in the painting on the left. And now we're looking at the one on the right. One thing that I wanted to mention, this painting, Monet never put this one up for sale. He kept this one at home. And you know, if you're an artist, you have to sell paintings to make a living. And so you would think, oh, okay, well, you're going to take all your best ones and put those for sale and, you know, get some money to pay your bills and whatnot. But there's certain ones that artists frequently hold on to. And this was a painting that Monet held on to. He did not put this one up for sale. And then the same thing for this one. He did not put this one up. He kept this for many years. This was in the bedroom of his home at Giverny. His son on a hobby horse. I like this painting a lot, but I feel like it's maybe not one of Monet's most well-known works, not because it's not a really good painting, just because he made so many great ones. There's certain ones that are really nice or impressive that kind of get pushed down the list of favorites or well-known ones, so to speak. But I'm surprised. I would think if another artist that was not as well-known as Monet would have painted this, it would have been one of their most famous works. But because Monet made so many great ones, it's just one of many, but I like it a lot. He did this still life with tea service. This is at the Dallas Museum of Art. This is his wife doing some embroidery work, sitting in front of a window. So on this one, this is an indoor painting, but notice how he's included a lot of plants inside this. So you can tell that gardening and flowers and plants were very important to the Monets, because even when you see pictures inside their home, you can see those elements included in there. And then Monet is very interested, like many of the Impressionists are, in Japanese art. And so he collects prints and Japanese items and whatnot. And so this is his wife, Camille, and she's dressed up in the traditional Japanese clothing of the day. And she put on a blonde wig, though. Her hair was not blonde, but she put on a wig because she wanted to be readily identifiable that she was not Japanese in this painting. So interesting enough. And this one is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Okay, so another thing that Monet frequently includes as subject matter are boats, bridges, and trains. And in particular, what he's trying to do here is he's trying to, number one, he really likes water. So again, you'll see that time and time again in Monet paintings, whether it's lakes or rivers or streams or the ocean. So you see water frequently. And he's also really interested in architecture. So he's known as this guy that makes all these paintings of gardens and flowers and stuff. But if you think about Monet's whole career, a number of his well-known works are of architectural aspects. There's the Rouen Cathedral series, there's the Waterloo Bridge in London, there's the train stations series. A lot of these different series have architectural components to them. He frequently includes bridges. Even the gardens at Giverny, the early ones, have the Japanese footbridge that he had installed. So Monet is very interested in architecture, and you can see that frequently throughout his work. So this is one of his most famous paintings. It's called Impression Sunrise. He did this around 1872 and 1873, and it was exhibited. And this is where the term Impressionism actually comes from. It's kind of a long story, but the oversimplified version is Monet put this painting on display in an exhibit. Some critics came to look at it, and this one critic in particular hated it. He basically said that it was not a finished painting, meaning it wasn't detailed enough. It looked like someone had just kind of sketched this out and then put it in a frame and hung it up on the wall. And so the critic was not a fan of it. He said, you know, this isn't even, I'm kind of giving you the oversimplified English translation, but he basically said, this isn't even a real painting. It's a disgrace. It's just like an impression of something. You know how maybe if you have a, like, if you push something, one thing down on another thing, like if you're walking on the beach and you make footsteps in the sand, your footstep will leave kind of an impression in the sand. And so that's what the critic was trying to say, like, this isn't even a real view of this scene. It's just kind of an impression. But the Impressionists, or as they would later be known, actually, they liked that term and they were okay using that. And so that's where the term Impressionism comes from, was this painting. Now, remember, when Monet is a young boy, he moves to the north of France, and this is where this painting was done at. So if you've seen this one before, this was done in his hometown. Well, kind of his adopted hometown. He moved there when he was a young boy. This is a painting at the National Gallery of Art. Again, he's really interested in water and the ships. This is where Monet moved to. He lives in a place at this point in time in his life called Argenteuil, which is northwest of Paris. I'll show you a map of it a little bit later, but this is a famous painting at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. There's some boats on the water, and he's also got the bridge included. I'm guessing on this one, he couldn't decide if he wanted to do the bridge or the boat, so he did both. So you have a sailboat here in the front, and then in the middle, kind of on the left, there's another sailboat. And then it might be hard to see depending on how big your screen is. But if you look kind of in the center of the painting, you can see there's some yellow color in the water. That's a canoe or a boat. And there's a couple out there. A man on the left is rowing the boat, and then there was a woman on the right with a parasol. And then he's got the bridge on the right side. Now, when we do our tours at the National Gallery of Art, I always bring this picture because one of the funny things is that happened is a lot of the Monet places where he painted at, you can go visit them today and see what they look like. And some of them look just as nice as they did when Monet was living. Some of them not so much though. So at that point in time in Monet's life, this was a very kind of small town. It was way outside of Paris for that point in time. And subsequently, the Parisian sprawl has kind of moved in and kind of annexed this particular area. And so the bridge has been replaced, and there's now these high-rise buildings. I mean, it's still part of a nice view along the water, but it's not quite as quaint as when Monet was there. This is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This is another bridge. This is the railroad bridge. So this one was a pedestrian bridge. This is railroad bridge. Again, you frequently see bridges in Monet's artwork. And so this is a map to show you where he was living. So before Monet moves to Giverny and settles down there for the second half of his life, he lives in a number of places, including Paris, the north of France, London, et cetera, et cetera. And at this point in time in his life, he's living in a place called Argenteuil. Now, what happened was he was living in Paris, but he ends up getting kicked out of 2 or 3 different places where he's living because he can't afford to pay the rent. He's a struggling artist at this point in time in his life. He can't doesn't have a lot of money to spare because while he's selling some paintings, he's not really selling all that many, and the ones he is selling, he's not doing selling for a great amount of money. And so he's kicked out of where he's living in Paris. He tried to broker or negotiate a deal with the landlord saying, hey, that money that I owe you for the rent, how about if I give you some of my paintings instead? And the landlord says, I don't want any of your stupid paintings. I want my money. Give me my money. And so can you believe that? He kicked out Claude Monet, threw him out on the street, which Monet was very offended by. So he moves to Argenteuil because, number one, it's where a lot of other artists are living at. So Manet, the artist Manet. His family lived in Argenteuil. He spent a lot of time there. There's several other artists that Monet can hang out with. It's also far enough away from Paris where the cost of living is a lot lower. So it's going to be a big cost savings for him. But yet it's also close enough to Paris that if he needs to go there to visit the art community or art dealers or go to the Louvre or anything, it's close by. So it was a good location for him. But at the time Monet was living there, it was really a separate community. Let me go back to this picture. It was the community on the left, its own little town, and then subsequently gets taken over by the Parisian sprawl, but it's northwest of Paris. And how would you get there? Well, you would take the train. And so this image on the left shows you the explosion in rail lines that have been built in France in the years after 1850. Just to kind of give you a context in American history, the Civil War was fought in the United States between 1861 and 1865, and that led to an explosion in this country as far as the number of lines of railroads. And same thing in France, if you can see the difference between 1850 and 1870. And this advertisement on the right is from the train company, basically advertising to Parisians that they can come out to Argenteuil and spend the day out there doing things like boating and going to picnics and stuff like that. There's the railroad bridge. And if you're in Paris, this is the train station that you would depart from. It's a historical photo. You frequently see trains or train stations or things like that in a lot of other Impressionist painting, not just Monet. This is the building today. And Monet is fascinated by trains, so he does a whole series of paintings on the train station, like Saint-Lazare. And this is the most famous one. It's at the Art Institute Chicago, but there's a number of these. It's one of Monet's series. One of the things he does is he gets captivated by a particular subject matter or a theme, and then he does several different versions of the same type of painting. And so that's what happens here with the train one. The most famous one, in my opinion, is at the Art Institute Chicago, but don't tell that to people at other museums that have one of these versions of these paintings, because they'll say theirs is the best, but I think this is the most well-known one, in my opinion. And this is what the train station looks like today. So imagine that. You can go hang out in a place where Monet made another one of his paintings. That's what his painting looks like. And that's what the train station looks like today. And there's a close-up. Now, one thing that really helps Monet is he spends a lot of time with other artists. And you have to believe that he greatly influenced these other artists, but they probably in turn also influenced and helped him as well. And so these next four paintings are of Monet, but they're by friends of his, by famous artists. This is a painting that was done. Monet was early in life, and it's a series of artists, and there's Manet on the left. He's doing the painting, and he's surrounded by other artists who are kind of watching and checking out his work. And so I put on here a label so you can see there's Renoir, there's Monet's friend Bazille, remember the guy that got killed during the war, the very tall gentleman, and then you have Monet. It's funny, Monet is the most famous person in this painting, but at this point in time, it was very early in his career. He was not famous, and so he's kind of stuck off to the right. In fact, of all the individuals in this painting, he's probably the least prominent of the ones. But Monet spends time with other painters, and so that no doubt would have helped him succeed because he's learning things from Manet and Renoir and Bazille, just like they're also learning from him. So let's look at some paintings that other artists did of Monet. This is the Monet family in their garden at Argenteuil. So before Monet moves to Giverny, he lives in Argenteuil with his wife, and they have a pretty large garden, not to the extent that they had in the other subsequent location, but still nice nonetheless. This is from 1874. It's the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And again, this is by his friend Manet. And this is the only painting that was ever made of Monet working in his garden. There's a lot of paintings of Monet And there's a lot of photographs of Monet working in his garden, but this is the only painting of Monet working in his garden. And it's by Manet. And so Manet came over to Monet's house to spend time with him, decided to make this painting. And then while they're there, Renoir shows up on the exact same day. So the same day that this painting was made of Monet and his wife and son, Renoir made this one, but he only included Monet's wife and son in this one. But again, he's spending time with these other artists, and that no doubt helps them all succeed, learning from one another and supporting one another and sharing ideas and things like that. This is a nice portrait that Renoir did of Monet in 1872, so he'd be 31 years old. Now, Renoir is very supportive and helpful of Monet for a number of reasons, not just as a friend or artistically, but also to a certain degree financially. So Renoir is also a struggling artist at this point in time, although the advantage that he has is Renoir is living with his parents. Monet is living with his wife and young son, and they're both trying to make a living selling their artwork, which is not going well for either one of them because Impressionism, while it's really popular now, it was not popular at this point in time. There wasn't a big demand for Impressionist, what would become known as Impressionist artwork. And so these two guys are really struggling. Now, again, Renoir is living with his parents. And so what he would frequently do is he would pack up the leftovers, like say after dinner, and he would take over the milk and the cheese and the bread that was left over from dinner and take them over to the Monets. And so they would have something to eat. And so Renoir does a great humanitarian thing by helping the Monet family keep afloat financially by giving them all this food during this point in time. So if you like Monet, you have to thank his good friend Renoir for keeping him afloat, so to speak. But he does paint this really nice portrait of Claude Monet reading a book, smoking a pipe. Here is another painting that Renoir did of Monet painting in his garden. This is the Wadsworth Museum of Art, and the garden theme is something you frequently see in Monet's painting, and here's a nice painting of him painting his gardens. And so again, they have that close relationship, Renoir and Monet. Then Monet does a number of works of gardens. So gardens is a theme that you see frequently in Monet's work throughout his life. But the importance of the themes or the number of times that he includes them really varies a lot. Sometimes he'll go through a several year period where he'll paint the kind of gardens around his home over and over again. And then sometimes he takes a break for a couple years and focuses on other things like train stations or haystacks or the ocean or stuff like that. At this particular point in time, Monet does a whole series of paintings in and around his garden. By this point in time in his life, his finances are really kind of up and down. He doesn't have a consistent stream of income coming in. He's selling some work, but then he also goes through stretches where he doesn't sell any. So it's really kind of up and down financially. But he had been spending time in his garden and kind of developing it to more advanced state than it was when he moved in. So let's look at these 5 paintings. This is outside of his home in Argenteuil. Notice all the beautiful flowers and plantings in and around the house. Kind of an early indication of what Giverny would be like when he would end up moving there. This is his garden. Remember that painting that Renoir did of Monet? This is around the same time. So it's got the same garden, same time frame that Renoir painted Monet. This is again outside of his home from 1873. This is his wife sitting on a bench. And so if there's a couple things going on with this one, number one is, here's the full view. The first thing that's going on is his wife had just lost her father. So she's very sad and distraught by that, thus the expression on her face. So oftentimes when you see his wife in paintings, she's smiling or looks very happy to a certain degree. People that posed for portraits at this point in time in history, you don't usually smile and laugh as much as you do today. But usually she, has a more happy expression on her face, so to speak. But in this particular painting, her father had just passed away, thus the sorrow look. So that's kind of thing number one. There's the close-up of that. And aspect number two of the painting is, wow, look at that nice garden in the background. So again, this is outside of their home. This is a couple years later. This is his wife. And this is their second son. And there's the close-up. Their second son's name was Michel. Their second son was the only one of the family members that outlived Claude Monet, and he inherited the estate at Giverny, and he's the one who donated it to the French government so they could turn it into a museum. This is a famous painting. This is at the Detroit Institute of Arts, my former employer. It's called Rounded Flower Bed. Sometimes it's also called Gladioli. Done in 1876. This is also a picture of his wife. She's got the parasol. It's a beautiful painting. If you look closely enough, you can, depending on the size of your screen, you can see the white color of the butterflies floating around. And notice, remember, if you can remember back to the flower paintings that we saw from Monet early in his career, how detailed they were. You can see the indications. Okay, yeah, this is definitely an Impressionist painting. He's not so focused on giving you an exact depiction of what the scene looks like. He's kind of more focused on the atmosphere and the light and how his emotions are displayed about this. Another thing that Monet frequently does throughout his life is go on walks out in nature looking for interesting subject matter. And so here's 4 paintings all painted around the same time. The one on the far right is also his wife and his son. Notice she's got the green umbrella, or the green underside of the parasol, which we saw that in this same painting. So it's funny, if there's a Monet painting that you really like suppose you really liked this one, what you should do is go try and find if he did other similar ones around the same time frame, because if you like one kind of particular subject matter in his work, there's probably potentially frequently other ones that might be kind of similar. So this is a good example, these nature walks. So frequently he's spending time outside away from his home looking for interesting things to paint. This is from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, called Meadow with Poplars. Poplars would later end up becoming a whole series of paintings that Monet would do. At this point in time, it's just an aspect of the painting. He's not focused on the poplars themselves. That looks like a beautiful place to go for a walk. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, poppy fields. And again, this is in Argenteuil, which is northwest of Paris. And this is probably the most famous one of this series by far. This is called Poppy Field. This is one of Monet's most famous paintings. It's tough to rank which ones are his most famous because he did so many well-known ones. But this one is at the top of the heap, especially amongst the works that he would have done during the first half of his life. This one I'm a little disappointed in because the coloring on the reproduction image is not as vivid and bright as the actual painting itself. I mean, it looks really nice, but in my opinion, the actual painting is much more striking, just FYI. And there's this one at the National Gallery of Art. Again, there's the parasol. So Monet at this point in time, his life is really kind of, let's see, how can I say it? Kind of up and down. And it really has a lot to do with his financial situation, depending on if his painting. I mean, think about it. If you have a regular job, you get a paycheck on a regular basis, every Friday or every other Friday or whatnot, you get X number of dollars. If you're trying to support yourself as an artist, your money just comes in whenever you sell paintings. And so sometimes you might sell a bunch of them, and sometimes you might go for a stretch and not sell any of them. And that's what happens to him. So his situation at this point in time is really kind of up and down, but it unfortunately takes a turn for the worse because his wife ends up passing away in 1879. So he actually did this portrait of her on her deathbed. That's Monet's last portrait that he made of his wife, and she's on her deathbed. She had had a number of health problems, and in prior to kind of modern times, when a woman had a child, that was a very serious medical proposition potentially. I mean, it still is, of course, but because of advances in modern technology, it's not as risky of an endeavor as it was, say, in the 1800s. So childbirth throughout history has been the thing that actually ended up killing a number of women. And so Monet, his wife, has their second son, and that does not kill her itself, that event, but her health, which was already pretty precarious, really starts going downhill after that, and she ends up dying a short time after her second son was born. So the complications from the second childbirth didn't lead directly to her death, but it kind of put a strain on her body, so to speak. But she passes away in 1879. And so now Monet's really distraught because not only is he not doing too well financially, his wife, the love of his life, just died. You can tell the strength of the relationship by, you remember, as we've been going through this presentation, the huge number of times he's painted her in all these different paintings. And now she's gone and he's by himself, and he has these two sons that he has to take care of. And so how is he going to do that? So Monet at this point in time is very distraught. The winter comes in. A lot of Impressionists don't do winter scenes. Monet does periodically from time to time. This particular time after his wife passed away, it was a pretty gray and cold winter in France, and so Monet captures that. Maybe part of this is documenting what's going on outside, and maybe also to partially giving you a sense of kind of where his emotions are, so to speak. But he was extremely distraught because he's at a point in time where just things are not going in his favor. This is a picture of him from a little bit later in life. This is another colorized photo. But he keeps plugging away. So he was very depressed after his wife passed away, but he kept sticking with it and kept working with the painting. These are all paintings of flowers and gardens in and around his home. The one on the left is at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The one on the right is at the Norman Simon Museum in Pasadena. Notice the scenes are very similar, and there's some debate on which one he painted first. You kind of have to wonder, did he paint the one on the left first and then decide, maybe he was painting the one on the right, and then his son showed up and decided to include him in the painting, or maybe he kicked his son out of the painting and just wanted to do the landscape. But there's a little bit of scholarly debate between which one of these two paintings, which are very similar, he painted first. But again, the one on the left at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., one on the right at the Norman Simon Museum in Pasadena, California. This is about a year and a half after his wife passed away. And that's his second son. Now, the people in the background, we'll talk more about them a little bit later, who those folks are. And if you have this beautiful garden, what you can do is you can take the flowers and bring them inside and spruce up your house. And so that's what he did here with these sunflowers. So the sunflowers painting on the right is a well-known work of his at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And where did those sunflowers come from? Well, he didn't get them from Vincent van Gogh. He got them from his own garden. And so, yeah, here is the painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, this bouquet of sunflowers. And Monet frequently paints outdoors. And I was talking about that one time. I was giving a tour at the National Gallery of Art, and this little girl, she says, "You said that he paints outdoors a lot, but what would he do when it rains?" I said, "Well, and he would paint stuff like this, flowers in a vase inside his house." But where did he get the flowers from? From his own garden. So that would be pretty nice to be able to pluck these flowers out, put them in a vase. And then on some rainy day when you can't go outside and paint, you could stay indoors and paint these. This is a well-known painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you only thought that Van Gogh made sunflowers. Not true. Although he's the most famous one. And I should have put up the comparison of the flowers from the early works. Remember the very early, when we were talking about the still lifes that Monet made, and how detailed those paintings were of the, this is one of two beautiful flower paintings that are at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is called Bouquet of Sunflowers. This is from 1881. Monet was an avid gardener. He actually got these flowers from his own garden. And you might have thought that Van Gogh was the only one that painted sunflowers. Not true. Although Van Goghs are a little bit more well known. I would think a lot of people might actually think this is a Van Gogh painting because it does look very similar stylistically. Actually, let me go back. It does look a little bit similar stylistically. I mean, you can see some differences between the ones from Van Gogh on the right. All 5 of those paintings on the right are from Vincent van Gogh, and the one on the left is from Monet. So you can see some similarities, but you can also see some differences too. And I won't bother to ask you which one you like better. What's happening here, he's really fully ingrained in the Impressionism style, which he helped invent. This is at the National Gallery of Art. And again, Monet's famous quote, "I perhaps owe having become a painter to flowers." Here are some walks that Monet took in nature. This is the willows of the National Gallery of Art. It's hard to tell, but that's the river, the Seine River in the background. So again, he's including the water aspects in the painting. Not so much an important part, but it is included nonetheless. This is from around the same time, woman seated under willows. So first you had willows, then you had woman seated under the willows. This is a path. This is in a place called Vitoy. It's not too far away from where he was living. So what I did for this one is I split the painting up. You can almost look at this as it's 2 different paintings. So it's a vertical. Here's the top portion of the painting. That's the town of Vitoy in the background. And then this is the path. So again, he's spending a fair amount of time just walking around places looking for landscapes that kind of strike his interest that he can end up making paintings for. There's the river. This is an area of northern France along the coast. Again, kind of geographically speaking, it's not too far away from Normandy. If you're, I include the Normandy for the Americans who may not be familiar with as much with the French geography, since almost everyone's heard of Normandy. Let's look at these 5 paintings that he made. So this, we're getting close to the end. This program we didn't take a break on, we just kind of continued plowing through. So this was a resort area in northern France, and so people would travel to the coast for vacations or to experience nature and look at the water and all that kind of stuff, just like they do today. These are historic postcards of the day. So what you would do is if you visited here and you wanted to send a postcard back home, you could buy one of these and send it to your friends or family, just like people do today. And this part of The coast is different. It has a beach area, but then it's also got these really high cliffs. I think about like the United States, the Atlantic Ocean coast is very flat in most areas, whereas on the Pacific coast of the United States, it has cliffs like this, like in California. And same thing on this French coast. There is the beach line here, but then it also really has these large, kind of rocky, jagged outcropping sections. And Monet was really fascinated by this area. He spends a lot of time here. He makes a huge number of paintings of this. And so these next series are all along this area. This is the most famous one of the series. This is at the Art Institute Chicago. Two young ladies out enjoying the day. And then those are sailboats in the background. So they're right on the water, but they're not on the beach because of the way the cliffs are situated. This is a fisherman's cottage. These are the cliffs again. There's two young ladies walking. And again, just a beautiful spot to, I should have brought a picture of what it looks like today because you still see these boats out in the distance. And so they're taking in the scenery. It's always, it's a really different perspective when you crop these pictures so I can blow them up. The reason I have to do that, when we're at museums, I always like people to look at the paintings from a little ways away, like 10 feet away or 20 feet away, but then get more of a close-up, just stand like a foot or two away. And really the only way you can do that is zoom in on them and crop them. But as far as the paintings go, like, gee, which one would you rather have, this painting or this painting? I mean, it's the same painting, it's just cropped a little bit differently. But that looks pretty beautiful. These next two paintings are at the Krieger Museum in Washington, D.C. For our friends in the D.C. area, when things return to the norm, make sure you check out the Krieger Museum. They have a pretty impressive collection of Monet paintings. And again, this is the same area. You can see the shoreline on the kind of the bottom left side of the painting. And then in the middle left, you can see the rocky outcropping. And then this is a nice one. This is a sunset scene. And again, two women walking along the beach. Now, Monet, remember, his first wife passes away, and it's really a kind of unusual story. What happened with him was, I have to walk through this. His first wife, Monet, and their two children are living in a home. And one of the persons that he had been selling a lot of his paintings to was this guy who was the heir to a department store chain, a Paris-based department store chain. And so this guy was pretty wealthy. He ends up buying a lot of Monet's paintings, really doing a good job of kind of help keeping him afloat. And then through the combination of the economy kind of falling apart in France at this point in time and some other personal decisions that this friend of Monet's made, his friend ends up pretty much losing all of his money. So this guy he knew was rich that was buying a lot of his painting. He ends up losing all of his money, and so he can't support himself. And the guy is married and has several children himself. And so the Monets and his friend decided, hey, we should all move in together. We can like live under the same roof, and it'll be a little cramped, but we can save money. And so that's what ends up happening. Well, then Claude Monet's wife passes away. And then the guy, the friend, he ends up running off. He goes to, I think, Amsterdam, and basically abandons his wife and children. So then you have Monet, the widower. He's there with his two children. Then you have this woman, Alice, who is the wife of his friend. Her husband has run off and left her with all of her children, and they're living in the house together. And over time, the romantic relationship develops between the two of them. Now, there's a little bit of a controversy as far as when the relationship actually started. It's not 100% clear, but suffice to say, at a point in time, Alice and Claude Monet end up in a romantic relationship themselves, and they end up getting married and would go to Giverny and spend the rest of her life together there. And so he writes a lot of these love letters to her over time, which is really kind of touching. So when he went to this part of France, she's back home with the kids managing everything. And he writes her this letter and says, how beautiful the countryside is becoming, and what joy it would be for me to show you all its delightful nooks and crannies. And so that was a letter he wrote to Alice. Now, Alice really plays an important part in Monet's life. This is the family, the two of them. So that's Claude Monet on the top left, and then that's his second wife, Alice, and their combined brood of children. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, there's 10 people in this picture. So you have the two adults, then you have the Monet children, then Alice and her first husband had 6 children of their own, but eventually her and Claude Monet get married. Now, she plays a really important role in his life, artistically or professionally, and also personally. Professionally, because since her husband was so wealthy, she kind of had a understanding or a perspective on how wealthy people behaved, how they purchased art. She knew a lot of people. She had contacts and stuff, and she was pretty business savvy. And so there's a number of reasons why Monet's career over time eventually goes from being a point where he's kicked out of places where he's living because he can't afford to pay the rent, to later on where he's very wealthy and successful. While Monet was alive, he was a successful artist. He had a staff of gardeners. He bought the property at Giverny. He expanded upon it. So later on in his life, Monet is he was a starving artist initially, but later on in his life, he was pretty much all financially set. And there's a lot of reasons why that took place. You could do a whole extended talk about that, but suffice to say that people's preferences in art changed over time. He just really stuck with it and stuck with it. He was focused on being a professional artist and was devoting all his attention to that. But one of the reasons why he ended up making it is because of his relationship with Alice. Again, she has this kind of insight into wealthy individuals. And even though Monet's father was pretty wealthy, he wasn't going out buying art and stuff like Alice's first husband was. And so she's also very business savvy. And so she gives him a lot of advice on how he can kind of, get his name out there and sell paintings and make connections with people. So she wasn't the deciding factor in him going from a starving artist being very successful, but she does play a really important role. And I feel like her role is not really appreciated or talked about all that much. I mean, think about it. If whoever's a prominent person, whether you're a man or a woman, oftentimes your significant other plays a big part of that. Like presidents of the United States are a great example. There's a number of presidents throughout history that they would have never been president if it wasn't for their wife either helping them or supporting them financially or et cetera, et cetera. And so I really feel like Alice's role in Monet's life, while it's somewhat known, doesn't quite get the credit it deserves. I mean, he probably potentially would have been a successful artist on her own, but she really kind of helped give him a boost. And then, of course, just the romantic side of things, the fact that he had lost his wife and was very lonely, and the two of them ended up marrying. So he subsequently marries Alice, and they have this kind of combined family, so to speak, of all these children. So that's what the photo here is showing you. Okay, so remember before I was talking about Monet and water, and yeah, that's like a reoccurring theme. So even in this next section, look at the number of paintings that we're going to be talking about that include water of some type. Now, you might not be able to tell these are water depending on the size of your screen or and stuff like that, but suffice to say, all 9 of these paintings have some type of water feature in them. So just really incredible that he's got that type of interest in water. And again, he always spends his time living near the water or close by the water, et cetera, et cetera. Hold on for 5 seconds while I check something on my computer. Okay. This is a winter scene, thus the white and gray colors. And then these are also water scenes. So this is a city or a town called Vitoy. It's also not too far from Paris. This is Vitoy in the summer from 1880. Just to give you a frame of reference, Van Gogh started painting or making artwork, I should say, in the early 1880s, and he died in 1890s, just to kind of give you that frame of reference between him and Monet. So this is the scene today along the river. Looks pretty nice, huh? Nice, quaint French town to go visit and along the river. And then one of the things that's really neat about the well-known French painters is, depending on where you're at, oftentimes the local government or the tourist association or whatnot will put up historical markers so that you can kind of figure out, hey, where were actually some of these paintings at? No, like obviously they can't do this all the time, but there's quite a few Monet paintings where there's a historical marker where it was created to kind of give you an indication of the spot. And so if you look at this painting, or picture, I mean, and you see the blue arrow, you can see the historical markers there, and they even set it up like an easel. Aha, and there it is. And so there's the easel. It's actually a historical marker that they've set up. And so Monet makes a whole series of paintings from this general vicinity, and that's what this is pointing out. And then the blue arrow, kind of keep an eye or kind of remember what that building looks like, because it's included in a number of the paintings. In fact, if we back up, you can see it right there in the kind of the middle section of the painting. And then you can see it there. Here's another view. This is the pathway up towards the river. So again, this is just a park that's along the river. This isn't like a major metro area, so there's a lot of open spaces. There's the full view of the painting. There's the close-up. And then if you look closely, again, depending on the size your screen is, if you look in the center of this picture or this image, you can see the building with the steeple. Here's another view, same area from 1880, very impressionistic style. Here's another view, same area, it's the river. One thing about Monet is, even though he's born in Paris, and he would live there the first few years of his life as a baby, and then periodically throughout his life, he would live there as an adult. But for the most part, he's not really a city guy. He prefers to kind of be out in the country. He likes nature and flowers and walking in gardens and parks and things like that. And so the places that he's lived for most of his life is places outside of the Paris metro area, so to speak. Thus, there's all these landscape type paintings. Okay, we keep talking about this water situation. So here's 5 more paintings we're going to be seeing up ahead that all have water in them. Although you may not be able to tell that because some of them are very impressionistic in style. This is a scene of some rapids. This is in central France. Now notice we're getting up there in years. Remember, we started out talking about Monet in the mid 1860s. We're now up to 1893. This is a painting of ice flows. It's very light in color, so that's not your screen being distorted. There's the full view. This is a winter scene, so of course it's whitish. This is a water scene, in case you can't tell. This is a morning view. And again, Monet's not trying to give you an exact depiction of what this scene looks like. He's more interested in depicting the light and how it interacts with the water and the nature. And here's all 4 of these paintings we just looked at, all on the same screen. So you can see, again, these are, you can tell he's kind of full-blown impressionist mode by now. He's not giving you as much detail as he did in some of the earlier paintings. Now, these are three of Monet's many series. So what a series for Monet is where he comes up with an idea to paint the same subject over and over again, and he's going to show you the scene in different times of the day, or different times of the year, or different atmospheric conditions, like a cloudy day versus a sunny day versus a rainy day, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are just three, there's many, many examples, but these are three examples of series that Monet did. The Poplars on the left, the Haystacks in the middle, and the Rouen Cathedral on the right. And he did a number of paintings of all three of these. So let's go look at the one they have in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They have the 4 trees. So these are poplar trees. And what happened, this is a funny story. This is on a property near where Monet was living. Now, the reason why we switched gears from 1883 forward is because 1883 is a really pivotal year in the life of Claude Monet. It's when he moves to Giverny, what would end up becoming his well-known estate. And he lives there for the second half of his life. But for the first 7 years, he doesn't own that property. He's renting it. And so if you're familiar with all of Monet's garden Giverny paintings, he does not end up doing those until he buys the property. And the reason being is because he doesn't start doing all the garden expansion and stuff until he actually takes ownership of the property. So for the first 7 years or so that Monet is living in Giverny, he's not doing very many paintings at that site. He's walking around in areas outside of his home base, so to speak, and looking for interesting subject matter. Thus, the Haystacks and the Poplars and the Cathedral and stuff like that. So these paintings from this series have a funny story. He saw these trees, thought they were interesting, wanted to do a painting of them, but then he heard that they had been sold to a lumber guy, and they were going to be cut down and used for wood. And you're like, oh, no, 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 I haven't finished my paintings yet. And so by this point in time, Monet's career has started to do well financially. And so he could afford to pay the lumber guy to basically hold off cutting down these trees until he finished his painting. So now what's interesting is, what did they use this wood for? Wouldn't that be cool if you knew like what happened to the wood that was in these trees? But I think that's been lost to history. I couldn't find any evidence of where the trees went to. There's the full view, but again, this is one of many paintings that Monet did of poplar trees. This is another one of the series. This is called Haystacks. So you may have seen a painting similar to this at a museum near you or on your travels, or if you're reading books or whatnot. This is the one they have at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's called Haystacks, Effect of Snow and Sun. And he does, again, a number of these at all different types of day, climate, atmospheric conditions, et cetera, et cetera. From 1891. Another noteworthy thing about Monet is quite a few of the Impressionists do not do paintings outdoors in the winter, not to name any but outdoors. But if you look through this whole career, even we've seen a number of paintings that he made during the winter months, which is not always the case for some of his fellow Impressionists. I'm not a big fan of cold weather myself, so I'm not going to shame anyone if they didn't make any paintings in the winter. So, and this is his Cathedral series. So Monet is an interesting guy in the sense that he really likes flowers and gardens and nature and landscapes and things like that. But he's also really fascinated in architecture. He does not live in cities very much in his life, but he does like visiting Paris, and he really likes going to London. If you look at his artwork, he spends a number of times making architectural types either, whether it's cathedrals or bridges or different types of buildings, and you can kind of see that again and again. And so that's the case here. So an interesting kind of contrast, a guy that likes flowers and gardens and nature and that kind of stuff, also really interested in architecture and buildings and train stations and stuff like that. So this is the Cathedral series. What he did for this one was this is a well-known French cathedral, and what he did was there was a lingerie shop across the way from the cathedral, and Monet rented space in that shop, and they had a partition set up so that he could paint there and both not be disturbed by the lingerie store customers, but then also not disturb them. Because I'm sure if you were a woman going in to buy lingerie, it maybe would have seemed kind of unusual to have this guy sitting there looking out the window painting the cathedral. But they put a partition up, so he didn't have to worry about that. And he paints a whole series of these works. He did most of the work at the site of the cathedral, and then took all the paintings back home to his studio and kind of finished them up there. There's the full view of that. And again, here's the side by side. So this is kind of one of the characteristic Monet things. If you had to list, like, I don't know, top things you should know about Monet, you should know that he frequently makes these series of paintings. This is not unique to him. Several other artists have done kind of similar things, but he did it quite frequently. Okay, let's talk about some of the later years of Monet's life. So we're coming into the home stretch. This is the final 13 paintings we're going to be looking at. And we're talking about the later years of Monet's life. And again, the big event that takes place for him artistically is in 1883 when he moves to Giverny and he rents the property for 7 years. Then he ends up, his finances improve and he ends up buying the place. Now, it's a kind of a complicated story about how he went from rags to riches in terms of his artistic sales, so to speak. Number of things happened to him. Number one is he just kept with his painting. And so think about it in your own life. If you do something for a number of years, over time, you're going to get better at it and better at it. And that's what happens with him. Another thing that happened was people's preferences changed over time. So initially, when Monet starts painting, people are not interested in the Impressionist style work, not from him, not from anybody else. And so the early Impressionists, most of them struggled financially unless they had some other means of income available to them because the paintings did not sell. But over time, over a series of many, many years, people's preference and interest change and people start to accept and embrace the Impressionist painting. So that's good for business, good for sales. Monet, some insight who he should talk to as far as dealers and stuff like that. So there's kind of all these different things that take place that Monet's life ends up transitioning from being a starving artist who gets evicted from some of the places he lives at because he can't afford to pay his bills to the guy who's able to buy Giverny and he's able to spend a lot of time and money expanding the gardens. And eventually he ends up actually having a team of full-time gardeners working there on his estate. So it's a real kind of long process. It's not like a overnight thing like he won the lottery or anything like that. But let's talk about the last 13 paintings of his career. Starting in 1890, Monet passed away in 1926. And we're talking about him from the years of him being 50 to 86. And this is actually a colorized photo of him outside his garden at Giverny. If you look closely enough, depending on how big the screen is, you can see the Japanese footbridge in the back of the photo on the right side above his shoulder. FYI. Okay, so this is Monet and Water, part 4. So again, a reoccurring theme for you to look for when you see any Monet paintings in the future is look to see if he has water in them, because he frequently does that. These top 2 pictures are of London, and the bottom 3 pictures are of Venice. Remember, Monet's a pretty well-traveled guy for his day. Do you recognize this building in London? What could that be? It's the House of Parliament. So obviously the most well-known buildings in London, and was there, of course, during Monet time. And again, he's really fascinated by architecture. And so he likes going to London for extended period of time. He went there every year for several weeks at a time over a several year period. And London has a really fascinating relationship with Claude Monet because he's French. And traditionally, the British and the French have kind of a somewhat friendly rivalry. You're kind of like 2 brothers, so to speak. But London's almost kind of like adopted Monet just because he liked the city so much. He ended up living there on 2 different occasions. He lived there briefly as a young man for several months, and then he would go back there on a regular basis later on in his career and paint a lot of the architectural features like the House of Parliament or the bridges and et cetera, et cetera. So London is kind of almost semi-adopted Monet, even though he was a Frenchman. So this is at the Brooklyn Museum. Again, if you go to New York, make sure you check out things outside of Manhattan because there's a lot of really cool stuff to see and do. This is one of their paintings, Houses of Parliament, Sunlight Effect. And this one's at the Met, House of Parliament Effect of Fog. And here's an example of, again, the Londoners' embracement of Claude Monet, where they have one of his paintings on the travel magazine. So I thought I would share that with you. I'm guessing there's point in times in British history where they definitely would not have put a French person on the cover of one of their travel magazines. But things that in modern times, the relationship's been great, but there have been a few challenges over the years. But fortunately, everything's good now. Of course, you can say that about a lot of a lot of countries. And this is the House of Parliament, more recent photo. Really spectacular. And here is Monet's painting. Now, I don't know when they took this photo. I went to London a few years ago. And the first time I went, I wanted to take some pictures and send back to my mom. And I was there for like, I think I was there for like a little over 2 weeks. And I kept waiting for the sun to come out so I could take a nice picture of this building with me in it and send it to my mom. Well, the sun wasn't out, and I was like, well, maybe tomorrow. And then I'd waited, and well, it didn't come out today, maybe the next day. And one thing does do another. Next thing you know, I'm there for 2 weeks, and it never really had any good weather. And that was March. And Monet was going at different times of the year, but sometimes in the winter as well. But eventually, I just had to bite the bullet and take some pictures, and it was a little bit overcast. But this picture on the bottom was probably more of a summer type view, whereas Monet is sometimes going there in the winter. And so when he's there, it's overcast sometimes and raining and foggy and cloudy and stuff like that. And he's really capturing that in some of these paintings that he did. And so what's another interesting point is the most famous part of this building is on the far right, Big Ben. But notice that Monet doesn't even include that in his painting. Well, why wouldn't he do that? I mean, if you're taking a photo, if you or I were going to take a photo, we would probably do like the one on the bottom. We'd want to capture the whole entire thing. Well, the reason why Monet doesn't include it is because he's not trying to give you a depiction of what the building actually looks like. Monet's thought is, you know what? If you want an exact image of what this building looks like, you can go get one of these photographs. I'm not a photographer, I'm a painter. And so what I want to do is I want to show you what the building looks like under different light and atmospheric conditions. And so that's what he's doing. And potentially he probably thought about not including Big Ben because when you look at the photo, that's where your eye instantly goes to. It immediately goes from left to right. Oh, okay, yeah, there's that. And he thinks, you know what, if I just chop that off, it won't be distracting people from my work. They can just focus on the painting itself. And so there's one. And there's the other, and very abstract. A couple people asked questions about Monet's eyesight. His eyesight does get very bad, but more so than the years after this. His eyesight did get very, very bad, but that wasn't really an issue too much at this point in time. Monet also goes to Venice with his second wife, Alice. They took the train there, and here are 3 paintings in New York City that you can check out, all of similar views. Monet spent several weeks in Venice. He was invited there by one of his friends. He paints a number of different things in the city. It just so happens that these 3 paintings in New York are all pretty much of the same view, but I wouldn't want you to leave this presentation thinking like this is the only thing he painted in Venice, because he painted a number of different structures. There's a painting that Monet made, for instance, that's at the National Gallery of Art. That's a completely different building. This is the building. You might have recognized it, one of the more well-known ones if you've been to Venice. This one is at the Guggenheim Museum, another fabulous museum in New York City. It's the building that's designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. This is their contribution to the Monet presentation tonight. This one's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And this one's at the Brooklyn Museum again. And then here's our more modern photo. And so let's do this. Let's look at the Monet paintings compared to the modern photo. And again, he's not trying to give you an exact depiction of what the building looks like. He's more focused on how does the light interact with the building, and how does the light interact with the water, and the changes that take place at different points in time. Here's another comparison. And here's another comparison. Monet in Venice. Now, Venice ended up actually being somewhat of a sad trip for Monet, because it was really the last trip that him and his wife Alice went on. They returned back to France, and not right away, but eventually, in the not too distant future, she ends up passing away. So Monet, the guy, he ended up outliving his mom, his dad, his older brother, 2 wives, and one of his 2 children. So Monet was a real longevity guy. But this was the last trip that he took with Alice. And pretty much after returns back to France, he does not really leave home all that much. Because you got to figure at this point in time, he's getting up there in years himself. He's not a young guy anymore. There's the full view, another full view, another full view. So again, Monet and water. Okay, so we've looked at a lot of impressive paintings by Claude Monet. What did he consider his masterpiece? Now, if some of you have been on one of our earlier Monet programs, you're going to know the answer to this one. But if you haven't, what did he consider his masterpiece? His garden. Wow, imagine that. Claude Monet makes 2,000 paintings, considered one of the most influential, popular artists in history, and his masterpiece isn't even one of his paintings. It's his garden. Wow. Imagine that. Who would have thought that? So FYI, direct quote from Claude Monet himself. Why did he consider his masterpiece to be his garden? Because it was so spectacular. That's why. So he moves into this house, and it already does have a garden to it, but Monet spends a huge amount of time investing monetary resources, time, effort, to make it even more expansive and spectacular. This is a color photo of him. All these photos I'm showing you of Claude Monet were all initially black and white photos. What people do now is they take people that are experts in this type of thing, they'll take black and white photos and they'll make them they'll colorize them. So just FYI, all these pictures that you've seen tonight were initially black and white photos that have been colorized. And so they're guessing this is what the garden would have looked like in terms of the color scheme. So again, Monet spends the second half of his life in Giverny. He lives to be 86. He spends the first 43 years other places, the second 43 years at Giverny. The first 7 years, though, he was renting the place, and he doesn't really go gung-ho on the gardens until he's able to come up with enough money to actually buy property. And over time, much every decade, until the end of his life. By the time he died, he was actually very wealthy. So he was starving. Notes again, this is a picture of what it looks like today for those of you who have not been to Giverny. And the most noteworthy feature is this lily pond. So there was a small pond there, emphasis on the word small, when he bought the property, and he made an effort to greatly expand it. So I don't even know if I would call this a pond. This is kind of more like a small lake, actually. When I think of a pond, I think of something like, I don't know, 5 or 10 feet across. And as you can see, if you look close enough, depending on the size of your screen, you can see some people in the background, just so if you haven't been here before. So just to kind of give you a sense of that. And so here we are. I hate to keep beating home this same issue, but here we are, more paintings of water featuring Monet. I should have went through and counted how many of the 50 had water. It's probably like, I don't know, 70 or 80% if I had to guess, at least in terms of this presentation. And this is a quick map. So This is France, and if you look at the kind of the center of the map, you see Paris, and then if you kind of move up to the top left, there's along the coastline is Le Havre. That's where Monet moved to when he was a young boy. And then the blue dot is where Giverny is. Now, for the most part, Monet spends almost his whole entire life in between, living in places in between Paris and the northern coast of France. So he's pretty much always near the water, partially just by chance or coincidence, partly because he likes the water so much. So that's kind of one reason why you see so much water included in his artworks. So let's go through some of these paintings. This is one of the most famous ones we've seen tonight. This is a bridge over a pond of water lilies. This is a Metropolitan Museum of Art. Done in 1899. And again, look when Monet is born in 1840. So he's 59 years old when he paints this. And this is actually a picture of him kind of in a similar spot. So again, this is another black and white photo that someone took the time to colorize. You can get a sense of what it looks like. Looks very similar to the painting. Now, he was much older when this photograph was taken. And also, too, the bridge now at Giverny is much closer to the water for various reasons, including tourist safety. Here's the painting, the full view. Now let's do this. Let's take this painting and let's divide it into two. Let's look at the top half and then we'll look at the bottom half. So here's the full painting. Here's the top half, which is this Japanese style footbridge. Monet actually had this installed. He's really intrigued by a lot of different Japanese things. Remember before I showed you the Japanese print? This is the Japanese style footbridge he had put in place. But look at the bottom of the painting. So this actually looks like a Monet painting, just looked like this, just this section. And so that's actually what he would end up doing. If you look at Monet's later works of the pond at Giverny, he does not include the bridge anymore. And so here's one example that we're going to look at in more detail. And here's another one. So again, let me scroll back. This is you can always tell these Monet paintings of his garden, for the most part, the ones that have the bridges in them are the earlier ones. Not always, he did a few a little bit later, which I'll show you an example of one of them, but for the most part, the bridges, or the paintings that have the bridge in them are usually earlier in the series. And so later on, he says, you know what, I don't want the bridge anymore, I just want the water lilies. And so that's what he does. So this is the bottom half of that painting. This is a subsequent painting. Notice there's no bridge. This is another subsequent painting, also no bridge, of course, because it's very close up. And again, this is what the water lily pond looks like today. Here's another view. Just really spectacular. And a key feature is these water lilies. And so again, when he moves into this place, there is a really small pond, emphasis on the word small. Over time, though, he greatly expands it through different resources. He actually had the river flow into here so he could get more water in here. And he has all these water lilies added, and he expands the plantings around the pond. So he really wants this to be a spectacular source of inspiration, which it was. This is a painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Water Lilies. Now this is 1919. This is a little bit later in Monet's career. These ones in this section aren't necessarily all in chronological order. I put them kind of more by thematic. This one is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art also. It's called Water Lilies as well. And again, here's the three. So the early Monet works at Giverny typically have the bridge in them. That's a kind of a common reoccurring theme in this series of paintings that he did. And then the later ones, they don't usually don't, not always, but usually don't. Monet is an interesting artist because you can, if you know a little bit about his work, like I'm guessing if you sat through this presentation and then you go to an art museum next week and someone tells you, hey, there's a Monet painting on the wall over there, that you could kind of look at it after sitting through this presentation and kind of guess like, oh, I bet that was done around you know, such and such early in his career or later in his career, just by looking for these kind of characteristics you can key on. There's the early one. Here's a close-up photograph of the water lilies. So this is what Monet really decided to focus his attention on with his paintings later on. Looks very similar. Not exactly the same, but you can kind of get the idea, right? You can see the flowers on the painting and the flowers on the photograph. Alex just asked if there are sharks in the pond. I don't think so, but that, you know, that might be a good idea because there's a lot of tourists, Alex. So, but I don't think there's any sharks in the pond. But thank you for that question. I appreciate that. And here's another close-up of the water lilies. Notice the mirror-like surface of the water, and you know that would be really challenging to be a painter and try and capture that and make it look realistic. But Monet is a talented guy. He's up to the challenge. This is a close-up of the water lilies. I like these paintings, and they're pretty popular for most people because the beautiful colors, the blues and the greens. It includes the flowers, and there was some reds and whites and stuff. Now, there's some other paintings he did around this time frame that are kind of adjacent type subjects. So the nice thing about these museums in New York, they have some of these other paintings. Sometimes, you know, when you go to a museum, if an art museum has like one Monet painting, they're doing good because there's only, even though there are 2,000 of them, they're scattered all over the world. Some of them are held by private individuals. Some of them are concentrated in a few museums, like the Met has 40. So whenever a museum has one Monet painting, that's really something to celebrate. But the advantage of going here to New York is you can see so many of them. I forgot to mention, you would be familiar with this if you go to museums on a regular basis, but for some reason you don't. You're not going to probably be able to see all these paintings at any given time, because what happens with a museum is they usually don't display all the works they have, because number one, museums almost always have more artwork than they have space to display it with. And number two, frequently they'll rotate the painting. So sometimes they might send a painting out to a special exhibit somewhere, or they might have to take it inside to their conservation department and kind of clean it up or work on it. So you're probably never going to be able to see all 50 of these paintings all at the same time. And if you go to museums on a regular basis, you probably already know that. But if you don't, just FYI. I once met a woman from Japan, and she had come to the National Gallery of Art, and I was talking to one of the security guards, and she had this really distraught look on her face. Like I thought maybe, her purse got stolen or she lost her phone or something. And so my security guard friend and I at the National Gallery, are you okay? What's wrong? And she held up her phone and showed us a picture, and she says, "Where's this painting at?" It was a Monet painting at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And we said, they actually just sent that to Spain for this Monet exhibit they're having. She's like, "Oh my God, that's my favorite Monet painting in the whole world. And I thought it was going to be here." And, and she had come from Japan. She didn't come from Japan just to specifically see that painting, but she was in town and she was looking forward to seeing this painting because it's there's like 3 really famous Monets at the National Gallery of Art, and this is one of them. And so when she found out it wasn't there, she was really, really upset. So you got to kind of make sure you find out if the paintings you want to see are actually there before you go check things out. So it's kind of a sad story. But fortunately for her, the National Gallery of Art has a lot of other Monet. At that point in time, they had 19 Monet paintings on display. So there were 19 other ones that she could go check out. Okay, so these are kind of the areas around the garden. This is the path leading up to the garden. This is a really unusual painting because you don't see many later works of Monet where he does include the bridge, but this is one of them. So that's one thing that makes it unusual. Remember I said he usually doesn't include the bridge in later works. I didn't say always, but there are a few examples, and this is what I mean. It's also unusual. It's kind of the coloring on it. It's like the fall colors of the yellows and the oranges and the reds. That's very unusual. That's at the Museum of Modern Art. Leave it up to the MoMA to have something kind of off the beaten path, so to speak, stylistically from Monet. There's a close-up of that. These are some plants that Monet had installed near the pond. So the garden was really the inspiration for much of his later works. And it's one reason why he doesn't really leave home all that much, because he sets up this spectacular garden. And it was kind of like a Disney World like subject matter for him. He didn't really have to go anywhere. Like there's all these cool things that he can just kind of stay in his estate at Giverny and paint on. So he pretty much really the last many years of his life does not leave all that often. And again, he's also getting older in life. You know, when he's in his 70s and stuff, he's not able to travel as easily. And if you got to figure at that point in time, if you live to 86 now, that's quite an accomplishment. But to live to be 86 in 1926, God, that would probably be like being 100 years old maybe today. That would have been much more unusual. So later on in his life, he has he's just not a young guy. Then also his vision, a few people asked about that or brought it up. So yeah, the last many years of his life he does have a lot of vision problems, which also would have contributed to him making the subject matter less detailed. Okay, we're getting close to the home stretch. These are our last two paintings. So these ones are very abstract, and these are two well-known works. So let's talk about these. This one is at the Museum of Modern Art, called Water Lilies. This one, if you look down at the caption on the right, look at the date, 1914 to 1926. What happened with Monet was he would frequently, sometimes when an artist makes a work, they'll just do it all in one sitting and knock it out. And sometimes they'll work on it over and over again and keep tweaking it and stuff. And Monet is kind of in that latter category. There were some paintings that he did on the spot, but he frequently tweaked and enhanced and modified his paintings. And so this particular one, he started working on it in 1914. And 12 years later, he still hadn't finished it. And then guess what happened? He died. So I guess it was finished then. But that's why on this one, the date is 1914 to 1926, because it was one of the several that he was working on towards the end of his life. He couldn't quite get it the way he wanted it. There's a close-up view. And again, it's at the Museum of Modern Art. But I saved the best for last, probably the most impressive. If you were to go to the museum, suppose you could get all 50 of these paintings in the same building and we could all go down there and check it out. There's probably one. There's probably one that you might like as your favorite, whatnot. But the one that would be most impressive would probably be this one. And it's the very last one we're going to talk about. It's another one of these paintings where he started work in 1914. And by the time he died, it was still somewhat of a work in progress. Now, if you look at it on the left, it's like, okay, that's cute. But you might not realize is the scale of it. So it's a really massive painting. And this is a picture of it at the Museum of Modern Art. And so, again, the paintings that we talked about, most of them are at the Met, but the MoMA has this one, which is really spectacular. And it's really large. It's actually three panels that are combined to be one painting. And over the decades, the museum has kind of set this up in different configurations. This was a prior setup they had. And this is the most recent one that I've seen. I haven't been to the Museum of Modern Art since before COVID, so I don't know if they've changed it since then. In fact, maybe I don't know if any of you would know if it's been rearranged, but this was pre-COVID. This was how the painting was displayed. And I wanted to include the chairs, or these little cushion chairs here, so you can get a kind of perspective of how large this thing is. I mean, it's really massive. And it's one thing that makes it so impressive. It's just the scale of it. And Monet spent a huge amount of time working on this. Again, the 12 years that it took to do this. Now, he was obviously working on other paintings at the same time, but it's really an extraordinary work. And he did a whole several different versions of this same type of thing, where he made this large scale paintings. And so you might have seen similar things as this to other museums throughout the world. But this one is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And again, as the 50 paintings that I showed you tonight, there's probably some that you like the best in terms of the subject matter or the style or the coloring, wherever. But again, if I had to guess, and if we were at the museum, And you could see all 50 of these in person. This would probably be the one that would impress you the most just because of the size of it and just the amount of time it would have taken to put something like this together would have really just been extraordinary. Here's a close-up of it. Actually, let me go back from the beginning. So again, Monet, born in 1840, passes away in 1926. So when he starts this, look, he's 74 years old when he starts working on this painting. And that's 74 years old in 1914, which a little bit different than 74 years old today. There's the full. This picture on the left, I chopped off. I had to chop off the left and the right side so it could kind of have any kind of detail. So that's why this version is a little bit not as wide as this one. This is the full view, but when you try and put the full view on a slide, it doesn't really come out all that well. And again, this was the earlier display at the Museum of Modern Art. They just to kind of mix things up, change the configuration of it from time to time. And this is the most recent version I know of. It could possibly have changed since the COVID, but I'm not sure. So FYI. And again, the seats give you the perspective. There's a close-up. And again, it's the close-up of the water lilies on the pond. And you can see the flowers, the lilies themselves, the water. He's trying to give you a sense of what the light would have looked like interacting with the water and the water lilies and the clouds and all the other atmospheric type things. Here's a close-up. There's no way of knowing this, but it would be fascinating to know how many hours it took him to paint this. He worked on it for years. But again, he was also working on other paintings at the same time. So again, a recap. We looked at 50 Claude Monet paintings in New York City. 40 of them were at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. 5 were at the Museum of Modern Art. 3 were at the Brooklyn Museum, or I should say are. 1 from the Guggenheim and 1 from the Frick. And again, these are the 50 that I know of, but I don't live in New York City. I've just visited there many, many times. If you know of any others that are in the New York City 5-borough geographic area that I missed, please let me know, because I'll do this presentation again at some point in time in the future, and I'll be happy to include anything that I may have overlooked. But 50 paintings of Claude Monet in New York. And there's nowhere outside of Europe where you can go see 50 Monet paintings in such a small geographic area, unless you maybe go to like a special exhibit that a museum is having. But in terms of the collection number of Monet paintings, this is going to be up at the top of the heap as far as places outside of Europe. And Monet did live a long life, but eventually all things must come to an end, and he passed away on December 5th, 1926. He's actually buried in a family plot at a church that's about maybe like a 10 or 15 minute walk from his estate at Giverny. And then I always like to close our Monet programs with this quote. It's my favorite Monet quote. It says, "Everyone discusses my art and pretends or tries to understand, as if it were even necessary to understand, when all that is really necessary is just to love." And so hopefully you love Claude Monet's paintings a little bit more today than you did yesterday.